On February 5, 1943, Commander Comder took over from Commander Neal as the leader of Task Group 50.1. Morton C. Mama Jr., who had served as a naval liaison officer at the 5th Air Force Advance Headquarters in Port Moresby, was formerly in command of the submarine Sailfish in the Philippines, and had also been part of the Southwest Pacific Submarine Staff in Western Australia. On March 15th, Task Group 50.1 was renamed Task Group 70.1. The same day, the U.S. Navy forces in the Southwest Pacific were redesignated as the 7th Fleet under Rear Admiral Arthur S. Carpenter. From that point on, the 7th Fleet was known for its motor torpedo boat squadrons. However, Task Force 70 never operated as a tactical force and existed only on paper. The 7th Fleet's commander, who also led the task force, maintained direct operational control over several independent task groups. The motor torpedo boat squadron commanders reported directly to the 7th Fleet commander, which gave PT boats in New Guinea an advantage over those in the Solomons. He had full control over operations from the start, with missions assigned to specific locations and access to the movement plans of other naval vessels. This approach reduced the risk of friendly fire, and throughout the New Guinea campaign, there were no instances of PT boats being mistakenly attacked by friendly ships. In contrast, 2 PT boats were accidentally destroyed by U.S. forces in the Philippines 3 years later due to local confusion, not a strategic failure. In late February, Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander Barry K. Atkins, and the first 3 boats of Squadron 7 under Lieutenant Junior Grade Ralph S. Cooley, along with John D. Bulkley and the ship Tulsa, transported the advance team of PT Base 6. This was necessary due to a severe shortage of cargo carriers. Bulkley and Tulsa returned to Cairns to hasten the delivery of essential base materials, spare parts, and supplies to Milne Bay. Tulsa later returned with 3 more Squadron 7 boats under the command of Squadron Executive Officer Lieutenant Robert J. Bulkley, Jr. 6 boats were sent to New Guinea temporarily until Base 6 could support additional vessels, while Bulkley held the other 6 at Cairns. Base 6 was set up at the southeastern tip of Milne Harbor in Kanakopa, a small circular harbor about 250 yards wide. Although the site was considered good by New Guinea standards, it was plagued with mud for months, to the point where a truck was lost in it. The base became the primary repair hub, and despite limited resources, Hilo made the best of the facilities while construction was ongoing. Some repair operations were old-fashioned. When an engine needed replacement, a boat would head to the west end of Milne Bay, collect a new engine from crates stored under a tree, use a small army crane to hoist it onto the boat, and take it to the dock. After removing the old engine, the crew would install the new one and return the old engine to its crate. Then, they'd return to Hilo for tuning and final repairs. Because there was no dry dock, an old maritime railway on the island of Cereba in the China Strait was used. It relied on a manual winch operated by local Papuans. 2 men would turn crank handles on each end of a drum, occasionally spurred on by another blowing a conch shell. The men increased their speed with each blast until exhaustion forced a break. A boat would take 2 hours to haul up, and the railway was so short that workers repairing the stern often had to stand waist-deep in water. Eventually, the manual crank system was replaced by a kerosene engine, cutting the haul time in half, though with less charm. Every PT boat in New Guinea had used the Cereba Railway at least once before Base 6 opened its first dry dock around June 1st. Although crude by modern standards, at the time it was extremely challenging. Tools and spare parts were in short supply. Hose clamps were abundant, but not much else. And Commander Mama regularly reported shortages in letters to the 7th Fleet staff in Brisbane. On March 5th, he noted that 320 drums of gasoline had gone missing en route to the advanced base at Tufi. By April 23rd, he reported he had no shafts left for 80-foot boats and was trying to repurpose damaged 77-foot shafts. A week later, He mentioned the Seabees responsible for finishing construction at Kanakopa were again delayed due to a lack of transport. Over time, progress was made, and the base began handling more boat maintenance. The outpost at Cairns had become so remote that by February, Commander Mama deemed it almost useless. Consequently, Outpost 4 was moved from Cairns to Kanakopa on October 18th and eventually became part of Base 6. Thanks to the creativity and determination of squadron and base personnel, high-low maintenance crews, and the boat crews themselves, enough vessels remained operational for nightly patrols. Despite this, a long-standing shortage of auxiliary generators posed serious challenges. Boats often shared a generator, moving it from one vessel to another each day to maintain patrol operations. The same practice applied to radios, radar, and other equipment. Crews shared food and supplies wherever possible to ease the burden. If a boat was out of service for hull repairs, parts were often taken from it to keep others running. When repairs were complete, the boat might then restock from others temporarily laid up. On March 1st, reconnaissance aircraft spotted a large enemy convoy north of Cape Gloucester, New Britain, reportedly heading toward Lae to support Japanese garrisons at Lae and Salamaua. The convoy carried 6,912 troops aboard 8 destroyers and 8 merchant ships. On March 2nd, more than 100 American and Australian aircraft launched repeated attacks. Despite being outnumbered by German air cover, the Allied air raids continued. Poor weather reduced the effectiveness of afternoon attacks, and Catalina flying boats followed the convoy through the night, dropping ineffective bombs. On March 3rd, the massive assault resumed, with bombers and fighters flying from Port Moresby over the Owen Stanley Mountains. By nightfall, only 3 warships and 2 cargo vessels remained afloat. One destroyer had a massive hole in its side, while the other was surrounded by an oil slick. Both cargo ships were ablaze. The remaining Japanese forces were expected to come within range of the PT boats by the evening of the 3rd, according to reports from Tufi and Milne Bay. Lieutenant Commander Atkins, who had taken command of the advanced base from Lieutenant Bowman, prepared 7 boats at Tufi. All 10 boats left late in the afternoon in 3 groups, positioning themselves in a line across the Gulf after Commander Mama arrived from Milne Bay with 3 more vessels. Atkins led PT-119, PT-150 under Lieutenant Junior Grade Russell E. Hamachek, PT-132 under F. Gardner Cox Jr. and PT-143 under Lieutenant Junior Grade John S. Biss. PT-119 and PT-132 had to turn back after hitting submerged objects, likely logs. At 11:10 p.m., PT-143 and PT-150 spotted a fire to the north. On closer approach, they found a 6,493-ton cargo ship motionless at sea, with large fires in the forward hold and a smaller one aft. The ship appeared abandoned. As it began to list and settle, PT-143 fired a torpedo from 800 yards that exploded near the stern. 5 minutes later, PT-150 launched another torpedo from 700 yards, which hit amidships and caused the ship to sink stern first in a dramatic burst of flames. Other PT boats, PT-111 under Edward R. Bergen, Jr., PT-66 under Lieutenant Junior Grade William C. Quinby, PT-149 under Lieutenant William J. Flitty, and PT-68 under Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert L. Child, also saw the fire and cautiously approached. When the flames flared up just before the ship sank, Flitty on PT-149 thought the ship had turned a searchlight on him due to the intense lights. He fired a torpedo, but once the lights went out, he couldn't find the target again. The third group, including PT-67 under James W. Emmons and PT-128 under James W. Herring, was also affected by the blaze. Around the same time PT-143 fired, PT-128 launched a second torpedo from 1,500 yards. The crew thought it had hit because of the explosion they saw, which had actually come from PT-143's torpedo. Despite missing, the boats were ordered to search farther west after the incident. No other ships were found, but all boats faced rough seas and bursts of rain. When the PTs reached the area, only 2 enemy ships remained: a destroyer that would be destroyed by airstrikes the next morning, and the damaged cargo ship that had been sunk. On March 4th, Allied planes returned and strafed everything still floating in the Gulf. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were left stranded in makeshift boats. Over the following days, the PT boats engaged and sank many of these troop-laden boats. Although it was a grim task, it had to be done. If these armed troops reached the shore, they would have posed a major threat to the lightly defended Allied coastal positions. On March 5th, Jack Ballas of PT-243 and Russ Hamachek of PT-250 spotted a large submarine about 25 miles northeast of Cape Hunt. It was surfaced and accompanied by 3 boats, 2 smaller ones with around 20 Japanese soldiers each and a larger one carrying over 100 men. These survivors were from the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. All PT boats fired torpedoes. PT-143's torpedoes veered off, and although PT-150's ran true, they missed. The PTs then used depth charges and machine guns to attack the submarine's conning tower, eventually sinking the 3 boats. After 5 days, a lifeboat carrying 18 Japanese survivors drifted ashore at Kirowina in the Trobriand Islands, about 120 miles north of Milne Bay. Commander Jeffrey C.F. Branson of the Royal Navy, in charge at Milne Bay, reported the landing. At the time, the Trobriands were essentially a no-man's land. The Allies controlled the coast of New Guinea to the south, and the Japanese held New Britain to the north. The presence of the survivors threatened the nearby Allied radar station on Carina, the only military site in the area. Commander Branson was taken to Carina aboard PT-114 by Frank Dean, Jr., who found the 18 Japanese in a submissive state and brought them back to Milne Bay the next day. One of the captured men, severely injured during the Bismarck Sea battle and likely saved by his capture, later sent Dean his American-made money belt as a gesture of thanks. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a stunning victory for Allied air power and convinced the enemy they could no longer use surface ships from Rabaul to Lae. They never tried again. Once the 5th Air Force began operating from Dobodura near Buna in April, the Japanese could no longer send destroyers or cargo ships to New Guinea's northern coast east of Wewak. Most supplies had to be moved by coastal barges. They did maintain a submarine shuttle between Rabaul and Lae and transported some goods overland through the Ramu and Markham valleys, but the journey was slow and difficult. The PT boats aimed to make night traffic so dangerous that the enemy would effectively be starved, while the Air Force stopped barge movement during the day. On the night of March 15th to 16th, Lieutenant Junior Grade Francis H. McAdoo, Jr. in PT-129 and Frank Dean, Jr. in PT-114 tried a new strategy. They waited in Mambere Bay, a likely unloading point on the southern side of Huon Gulf, to ambush barges. PT-114 dropped anchor, while PT-129 slowly cruised on one engine to scout for barge activity outside the bay's entrance. Due to strong currents, both boats drifted into the harbor. Unaware that 6 barges had entered the bay, 2 of them collided with PT-114 in the rain and poor visibility. Dean believed the Japanese mistook the PT boat for one of their own, as their crew acted casually and didn't attack. The barges were so close that the PT's forward .50 caliber guns couldn't angle down to fire. The crew used submachine guns to rake the barges, then started the boat and cut the anchor when it stuck. Fire from submachine guns and the rear .50 caliber turrets sank one of the barges. The other was trapped under the bow and was crushed as the PT-114 moved, causing it to sink. As the boat exited the bay to meet PT-129, 2 more barges were destroyed by forward gunfire. When the 2 boats returned, they each sank one of the last remaining barges. Late in the afternoon on March 17th, While PT-67 and PT-119 were refueling at the Tufi jetty, a sudden fire broke out between them. The flames spread rapidly, and the boats couldn't be moved in time. Crew members had just enough time to jump overboard. Ammunition and gasoline tanks exploded, and both boats sank at the dock. Just behind them, a small Australian cargo ship, AS-16, caught fire while unloading supplies and was destroyed. The flames spread to the jetty and a nearby gasoline dump. 6 depth charges stored ashore exploded in a single powerful blast, adding to the destruction. Most of the gasoline in the area ignited, except for 700 to 800 drums stored across the cove. The fires burned into the next afternoon, fueled by leaking gasoline. In total, the fire destroyed 2 PT boats, the AS-16, 4,000 barrels of gasoline, 6 depth charges, the jetty, and a hut filled with equipment, spare parts, fueling pumps, and ammunition. Amazingly, no one was killed or seriously injured despite the speed and intensity of the fire. It was later believed that a local resident had lit a cigarette and carelessly tossed the match into the water, igniting the gasoline on the surface. After the Buna campaign ended, Allied ground forces continued advancing along the coast, allowing for the establishment of a more developed operational base. The patrol boats operated out of Tufi and ventured into the Gulf, but the distance was so great that they spent most of their time simply traveling to and from their patrol areas, leaving only a few hours for effective operations. Relocating closer to the Gulf near Cape W would save around 180 miles of travel per patrol. On March 24th, Commander Mama landed PT-142 on the east side of Cape Hunt in Douglas Harbor and stayed overnight. The harbor seemed to be free of Japanese presence and suitable for a PT boat base. Shortly afterward, the HMS Masia arrived in Tufi, bringing a small base force and supplies. The Masia was an unusual vessel, a former World War I destroyer converted to diesel power in 1933, which had spent time hauling bananas in South and Central America before ending up in Australia. On March 28th, Masia sailed from Tufi to Oro Bay to pick up 50 Army soldiers for base security at Douglas Harbor. Before reaching Oro Bay, Japanese dive bombers spotted the Masia while it was still about 6 or 7 miles offshore. Mistaking it for a warship, the Japanese pilots enthusiastically attacked. The Masia was heavily damaged by multiple direct hits and eventually sank. While only one PT man was injured, there were casualties among her own crew. Survivors were rescued and taken to Oro Bay. Unfortunately, the loss included all the essential base supplies, tools, spare parts, fuel pumps, 400 barrels of gasoline, and radio communication equipment. It took nearly a month to replace the lost gear, delaying efforts to establish a new base. Though they didn't sink a warship, the Japanese attack significantly disrupted PT boat operations in the area. On April 8th, Lieutenant Commander Atkins, aboard PT-141, and Major General Horace H. Fuller, commander of the 41st Infantry Division, conducted a reconnaissance of Marrow Harbor, about 40 miles beyond Cape Hunt. Marrow Harbor appeared to be a better location than Douglas Harbor, being free of enemy activity and saving over 200 miles per patrol. The Marrow River, which emptied into the harbor, had deep water flanked by tall trees, providing excellent natural cover for PT boats moored along the riverbank. Atkins made arrangements with General Fuller for the 41st Division to secure the harbor and began setting up the advanced base on April 20th with PTs 142, 66, and 149 operating between Milne Bay and Morrow. From then on, Tufi was used only for emergency refueling. As the enemy advanced to Canal on the southwest coast of New Guinea, they began sending scouting parties eastward and upriver to Tanamra, a Dutch colony located deep inland along the fast-flowing Moroi River. If they could establish a presence in Tanamra, enemy troops could easily float downstream toward Moroi, the southern capital of Dutch New Guinea. This would bring them within 250 miles of the northernmost point of Australia. the York Peninsula. There were concerns the Japanese might attempt to cross the Torres Strait or even strike Darwin or the Gulf of Carpentaria. To prevent this, Moroy was secured by Australian ground forces, and U.S. Army engineers began building airstrips for fighter planes. In preparation for establishing a base at Moroy, Lieutenant Commander Bowley ordered PTs 133 to 138 to be towed from Cairns to Thursday Island, which lies in the Torres Strait near the tip of the York Peninsula. This took place on April 16, 1943. On May 1st, Tulsa and two minesweepers towed PTs 127 to 132, the remaining boats of Squadron 7, from Milne Bay to Thursday Island. PT Base 10 was also established in Darwin to provide support and maintenance in case of a sudden redeployment westward. Although the Japanese were still about 1,000 miles away at the end of May, additional PT boats were needed in eastern New Guinea to support the occupation of the Woodlark and Kiriwina Islands. On June 6th, John Bulkley moved PTs 133 to 138 to Milne Bay, leaving PTs 127 to 132 and a base force under Lieutenant Robert J. Bulkley, Jr. at Thursday Island. These boats, later designated as Motor Torpedo Boat Division 19, remained stationed there as a precaution in case of a Japanese diversionary attack through the Torres Strait. The Japanese never approached Thursday Island, and no combat occurred there. Launching torpedoes within 15 miles of New Guinea's southern coast would have been problematic due to the shallow waters. A torpedo would likely bury itself in mud on its first dive. The coastline around Frederick Hendrick was especially tricky, with shallow water extending far offshore, making it easy for ships to run aground. Moroy itself was a small, unhealthy settlement built on a thin strip of land just above swamp level, stretching across hundreds of square miles in southern New Guinea. The Moroy River was both strange and dangerous. A few miles above town, the river crossed itself at a right angle, flowing east to west, circling an island, then returning to the crossing from the north before heading south to the sea. The river carried logs, floating islands, and other debris, posing hazards to PT boats. By the end of July, the Royal Australian Air Force was operating planes from the new airstrips, and Australian forces were well established at Moroy. It appeared that the Japanese were too engaged elsewhere to launch a major attack on the Torres Strait. Eventually, 3 minesweepers towed the PT boats back to Milne Bay. Although the threat to Darwin had diminished, it had not completely disappeared, so PT Base 10 continued to support patrol aircraft in Darwin throughout the New Guinea campaign, even though no PT boats were ever stationed there. The landings in the new Georgia Group in the South Pacific were coordinated with the occupation of Kiriwina and Woodlark Islands and of Nassau Bay, located 15 miles southeast of Salamaua on the New Guinea coast. These islands were to be used as bases for air attacks on New Britain. Since neither Woodlark nor Kiriwina was occupied by the enemy, no strong resistance was expected, though there was a risk that Japanese submarines or destroyers from New Britain might try to attack our supply ships once alerted. PT boats joined the landing force on June 30th and began nightly patrols off the islands to guard against such threats. Lieutenant Pat Monroe established a PT base at Woodlark with 6 boats from Division 23. A base was not set up at Kiriwina initially due to limited anchorage and difficulties in delivering fuel. Instead, John Bulkley moved his boats to Ferguson Island, 70 miles south of Kiriwina, and began shuttle patrols that kept 2 boats on station each night off Kiriwina's north coast. These patrols continued through September without enemy contact. As the 7th Australian Division pushed over the mountains toward Salamaua, Nassau Bay was selected as a supply point from Port Moresby. All division supplies